Good morning, Ben.
Hey, Gary. How you doing?
Doing well. Been an active morning. And first of all, just your thoughts. It didn't take long, 8 days from the time Greg Goff was dismissed to the announcement of a hiring of a new head baseball coach in Brad Bohannon. Just your initial thoughts.
Yeah, Brad is a guy who has a really strong reputation as a recruiter around the Southeastern Conference. He's been in the league as an assistant coach since 2004. Spent most of that time at Kentucky, I think from 2004 to 2015, and the last 2 seasons at Auburn. So he worked for John Cohen at Kentucky and then worked for Gary Henderson at Kentucky, then for Butch Thompson. Was one of the guys who was really kind of key in helping John Cohen build that program up, and then in helping Gary Henderson maintain it at a level where it was making NCAA tournaments, which Kentucky had not done before. And then in the last couple of years has helped Auburn kind of turn around from the Sonny Galloway era and make an NCAA tournament this year, and they had a very strong season as well.
You know, you've got a background in Lexington yourself. You went to school there, so I'm sure you've got, some previous experience with Brad Bohannon. What little I know about him, he's well-liked, terrific recruiter, very personable, young, still a young guy, even though he's got quite an extensive resume, seems to have a lot of energy. Would seem, at least at first glance, to be the kind of guy you'd want to bring into a program where you're going to have to do some rebuilding, and it's going to take a little bit of time.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. The key word in all of this is recruiting, because that's really what Alabama needs to do at the moment, and that's what Bohannon is really good at. I don't think that it's a huge secret that the talent level for the baseball team could stand to be upgraded. Not to denigrate any of the current players, I think that based on what we've seen from this season, it's kind of obvious in the last couple of seasons that there are some positions that need some help, some places that need some shoring up, and he's done a really good job of that wherever he's been before. Both at Kentucky and at Auburn, that's kind of what he's done.
At Alabama, he's coming into a situation that this will be the third year in a row that they've had the third different coach in 3 years. Of course, Mitch Gaspard resigning, Greg Goff being fired after 1 year, and now Brad Bohannon. Only won 5 conference games, 19 games overall. This is a guy that's been around a lot of winning, but as we alluded to, has also been around programs where he's had to come in as an assistant and help turn things around. So I imagine patience on one hand, and at the same time, on the other hand, that youthful enthusiasm, trying to get a recruiting class together and trying to get out and surprise some people. How do you think he balances expectations with the reality that he's taken over a roster that's going to have to be rebuilt?
Yeah, I think most folks, looking at the situation with the baseball team right now, understand that this is not a program that's going to be contending for Omaha probably in the next couple of years. There have certainly been some really fast turnarounds in college baseball. And there are ways to turn over the roster where you can bring in a lot of new talent very quickly. But I do think that, looking at where Alabama is now and where Alabama has been recently, there's probably a good understanding that it's going to take at least a little bit of time to get back to the point where they want the program to be.
It happened fast. It seems to be, and with Auburn in a regional, go ahead and make the announcement today. Of course, can't introduce him until Monday. Clearly, Byrne had a direction in which he wanted to go. I don't know how much you know, Ben, about how many guys that he talked to, but it would seem that certainly Bohannon was one of the first guys that he pursued, if not the first guy.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would imagine we'll hear a little bit more about the process as it goes on. Obviously, this just happened within the last hour or so. But given just the time frame of 8 days, I would bet that he was, perhaps the first. And if not the first, then certainly one of the very first calls that was made. If you look at Greg Byrne's background, it might be jumping to conclusions here, but it seems like you can draw a pretty straight line directly from Greg Byrne to John Cohen and their relationship, and from John Cohen to Brad Bohannon and the time that they worked together.
The fact that Greg Byrne hired John Cohen at Mississippi State, and Ben, that was not a completely popular move at the time, because Ron Polk wanted Tommy Raffo, his assistant, even though Cohen had played for him as well, and Polk was not happy. But Byrne stood up to that criticism and hired Cohen, who did an unbelievable job, is now the AD there. At Arizona, he hired Jay Johnson, who has done an incredible job in a couple of years there. So he's got a real positive hiring record as far as baseball coaches are concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was one thing that made folks feel okay about his decision to let go of Greg Goff after 1 year, was that this was not a guy who was going to be in his first baseball coaching search. This was not a first-time athletic director. This is a guy who had hired 2 baseball coaches before, who had taken their programs to the College World Series at really good programs. And hopefully the third hire ends up being kind of similar to what the first 2 were in that situation.
Greg Byrne said at his press conference when he announced that he was dismissing Coach Goff that, he didn't want to hear about this. If he had to read about it in the paper or heard about it on the radio or television, that probably wouldn't be the new baseball coach. Are you impressed that Alabama actually got to break the story in this era of everything being broken on Twitter or leaking out, that Alabama was the first to put out the information on Bohannon? Certainly there was speculation, but as far as any reports, they were able to break this themselves.
Impressed might not be the first word I'd use. I might use the word annoyed, given what my job is.
I know, but it doesn't happen much anymore.
Yeah, you're right. And I think that was one thing that Greg Byrne really kind of wanted to set the tone of when he arrived at Alabama, and then he kind of reinforced it last week at his press conference. And he managed to deliver on it this morning, much to our chagrin. It's not something that happens a lot. I think the speed at which they moved with this hire really probably aided with that. Like you said, this was a guy that a lot of people speculated might have been the coach, but given how quickly it happened, there was almost no time for folks to kind of get out there and get in front of the story before Alabama could release it this morning.
Ben, with your experience of having known Bohannon a little bit, I mean, I just keep reading recruiter. I mean, everything that you read from a baseball standpoint. Do you have any idea? Is he a hitting guy, a pitching guy, a field? I mean, where's his expertise in terms of the game being played on the field? Do you know?
He would fall on the hitting side of things. So in some of John Cohen's earlier staffs at Kentucky, where Gary Henderson was the pitching coach, Bohannon would have been the hitting coach and the recruiting coordinator.
Staff-wise, of course, it doesn't have to be really, really quick, but do you have any clue on, will any of the current staff members be interviewed? What do you know about him putting together a staff? Anything at this point?
Right. Well, we asked Greg Byrne at his press conference if there was a chance that Terry Rooney would get a look at the head coach position. We know that is not the case. We know Terry Rooney is at least still in Tuscaloosa and still working out of the baseball offices at this point. I don't know if you might get a look or not, or at least just a courtesy interview to remain on as pitching coach. I would certainly imagine that Jake Wells, the hitting coach, the bench coach from the last year, would be moving on somewhere else. Derek Simmons, the volunteer assistant who arrived at Alabama after being a full-time assistant at Kennesaw State, was really pretty well regarded by, I think, just about everybody around the program last year. If there's anybody who's asked to stay on, I'd say he might be the most likely. But you never really know. It kind of depends on how a new coach wants to construct his staff. A lot of those guys will want to have when you have a head coach, 2 assistants, and a volunteer assistant, will want to have 2 hitting guys and 2 pitching guys. So you never know if they're willing to kind of work that balance out or how they want to construct the staff.
Well, it didn't take long. Alabama has turned the page from Greg Goff to Brad Bohannon, and Ben Jones is on top of it. One final thing, Ben, since you follow baseball very closely, we've talked so much about the 11.7 really ad nauseum. It is what it is, but a new coach coming in, you've got players returning, you've got signees. I know under the previous coach, but still Alabama baseball signees. How much work is going to go into managing this roster and, figuring out who they keep and who comes in? Or do you think they try to bring in some of their own recruits, try to keep this recruiting class intact? I mean, that sounds like that could be a potential mess.
Boy, wouldn't that be fun to see an Auburn assistant trying to flip Auburn players to Alabama and trying to keep Alabama commits intact? I think that's a good point that you raised, though. I think that it might be a little bit less of a mess than what you're looking at, just because of how quick the hire was. 8 days after Goff was let go, in a situation where there wasn't a whole lot of build-up to where the head coach was being let go. It's not like there was a whole lot of speculation during the season that the head coach was going to be let go that could have hurt their recruiting. So just having barely over a week without a full-time head coach in place, I think probably helps Alabama retain more of its recruiting class. You've got a guy who's going to be able to come in now and contact any of the commits and signees that he wants to well in advance of the Major League Baseball draft, and really has a little bit of time, a couple of weeks, to build up some kind of relationship with them or learn about them, and evaluate any of those guys that he's not already familiar with. So from that perspective, I think the timing of the hire works out pretty well for recruiting.
Yeah, and we know about the Alabama-Auburn rivalry. Clearly, it's one of the best in collegiate sports. But I guess it'll be a little friendlier now with Butch Thompson and Brad Bohannon, obviously having worked together and being close friends. That'll be an interesting dynamic when these two teams face off next year, the first time in Montgomery, and then in a 3-game series in Tuscaloosa.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that series in Montgomery has always been really great. I've been able to go down and cover it the last couple of years. It's kind of interesting how the rivalry has worked out in recent years, where Alabama has really just owned Auburn in the weekend series for about the last 5 or 6 seasons. And yet at the same time, Auburn has just dominated that midweek series, I think winning something like 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 11. It'll be interesting to see kind of where the rivalry goes from here and what direction both of those programs take.
Great stuff, Ben. Appreciate you jumping on with us on short notice.